36,000 years. That is the number on the tablet. Not a myth, not a footnote. A number carved in clay, attached to one name, copied by scribes who never explained it and never apologized for it. The name is Dumuzid. His title, shepherd. Not a god, not a king dressed in divine language. A shepherd, ruling longer than every human civilization combined, recorded as plain fact. The tablet does not call this legend, it calls it kingship, and kingship, according to the same list, had already fallen once, in a different city to a different man, before Dumuzid ever touched it. The tablet is not a story, it is a list. Lists do not usually survive 4,000 years, buried, forgotten, dug back up. This one did. Copied, recopied, carried across cities, dynasties, centuries, until versions of it turned up in archives from Nippur to Lhasa to Kish. Scholars call it the Sumerian King List. The most complete copy is a small clay prism, catalogued under a name most people will never learn, the Weld-Blundell Prism, small enough to hold in 2 hands, compiled centuries after the events it claims to record, assembled from older lists that no longer survive on their own. Inside it, a record of every king said to have ruled Mesopotamia since kingship itself began. None of the surviving copies agree perfectly with each other. Some name cities in a different order, some assign a slightly different number to the same king, some break off early, mid-dynasty, the clay simply too damaged to read further. This is not a flaw in the tradition. It is a fingerprint of how the tradition actually moved through history, hand to hand, scribe to scribe, each copyist working from whatever exemplar happened to survive in his own city's archive, none of them able to check their version against some original master text, because no such single original text has ever been found and may never have existed at all. It does not start gently, not even for a moment. Kingship descended from heaven, not founded, not established. Descended, like an object, a thing that could be handed from one place to another, the way a torch passes hand to hand in a relay no one remembers starting. And then the list does something strange. It names a city, not a hero, not a god, not a founding myth with a beginning and an end. A city, Eridu. Eridu is real. Archaeologists have excavated it in southern Iraq. Its earliest layers date back further than almost any other settlement in the region. Further than Uruk, further than most cities anyone has ever called the oldest in the world. The tablet agrees with the dirt on this point. That is more than can be said for most of what comes next. Real place, real excavation, real archaeological layers stretching back into the earliest days of settled life in the region. 2 kings ruled Eridu before it fell, Alulim, Alalngar. Their reigns are not measured the way a modern record measures anything, not in years that fit inside a life, not in decades, not in centuries. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalngar, 36,000 years. 2 kings, 64,800 years between them. In a document that otherwise reads like a bureaucratic register, the kind that tracks grain, taxes, boundary disputes, not eternity. No footnote, no aside, no scribal apology for the impossibility of it. The number sits in the list the way a modern census lists a mayor's term. Flat, procedural, unremarkable to whoever wrote it down. No hedge, no wink to the reader. Sit with that before moving on. The list does not treat this as legend. It treats it as administration. Then 4 words end the section. Eridu, its kingship, fell. No war narrated. No flood described. No famine, no betrayal, no collapse explained. Just the transfer, the same clipped formula every time. Kingship was in one place. That place fell. Kingship was carried somewhere else, to Bad-tibira. This formula is the real architecture of the document, more than any single reign length. Every fallen city in the list follows the identical grammar. A place holds kingship, a place loses kingship. Kingship moves to the next place. As if the scribes cared less about glorifying any one king than about tracking a single object as it passed hand to hand across a landscape that kept losing its capitals. A relay, not a biography. A ledger of transfers, not a gallery of heroes. Whoever built this formula was not interested in the ordinary tools of ancient storytelling. No omens, no prophecies fulfilled, no enemy armies at the gate. The verbs alone tell almost the entire story. Held, fell, carried. 3 words doing the work that an epic poem would normally stretch across hundreds of lines. It is the difference between a war memorial listing names and dates, and a novel describing the war itself. Both true, both about the same events, but built for entirely different purposes and answering to entirely different standards of what counts as necessary detail. Bad-tibira does not appear from nowhere, a known site in southern Mesopotamia, associated in later tradition with metalworking and herding, a name that essentially translates to something like Wall of the Smiths. According to the list, it becomes the second place on Earth ever to hold this inherited ancient kingship, the second stop in a relay that had already run for tens of thousands of years before it reached this city's gates. A real place, on real maps, in real excavation reports. Inheriting a number no real place should be able to inherit. What happened at Eridu? Still not fully known. Why did kingship need to move at all? Never explained. What broke exactly in a city old enough that the ground itself agrees with the tablet? No motive, no disaster, no divine punishment in the surrounding lines. Only the bare fact, one city held it, then did not, then another city did. And so kingship arrives in Bad-tibira the same way it left Eridu, without ceremony, without explanation, folded into the same flat administrative tone that turned 64,000 years into a single unremarkable sentence. There is a reason scholars usually split this list in 2. Everything before the flood sits in one section, everything after sits in another, because everything before it plays by different rules. After the flood, rains shrink to numbers a person could believe, decades, sometimes a century. Before it, they never shrink. Tens of thousands, city after city, king after king. As if a different unit of time were being used, and nobody bothered to say so. Symbolic time. Sacred numerology built from a base 60 system. Astronomical cycles disguised as biography. Political propaganda stretched backward to flatter a dynasty. Scholars have argued all of it, for over 100 years. None of it proven, none of it disproven. The explanations sit unresolved, the same way the numbers themselves sit unresolved in the clay. It is worth pointing out, too, that the Sumerian King List is not alone in stretching early lifespans past anything believable. Other ancient traditions from the same broader region do something strikingly similar with their earliest ancestors. Enormous ages at the start of the record, shrinking generation by generation towards something a human body could survive. Whether that similarity reflects a shared source, or simply a shared instinct for marking mythic time, no one has settled definitively. Why does any of this matter, 4,000 years later, to anyone who isn't a specialist? Because the pattern is not a curiosity, it is a structure, and once a structure repeats, the question stops being, is this number real? And starts being, what was this list actually built to track? What makes Eridu's transfer worth pausing on? It is the first instance, not an isolated one. The list will repeat this exact structure, hold, fall, carry, city after city, for as long as the antediluvian section lasts. Once is an anomaly. A repeated formula is a structure, and structures are built on purpose, even 4,000 years later, even after the purpose has been lost. By the time kingship reaches Bad-tibira, it has already survived one collapse, already been carried once. The scribes do not treat this as remarkable, they simply continue the register, the way a ledger continues after one account closes and another opens. The list does not pause here either. It moves straight into naming Bad-tibira's kings, and one of them is where the numbers stop being merely large, and start becoming impossible to look away from. The list moves through Bad-tibira's kings the way it moved through Eridu's, one name, one number, no commentary, no ceremony, until it reaches a name that reads almost like an afterthought. Dumuzid. The list gives him a title before it gives him anything else at all, and the title is almost aggressively ordinary. Shepherd, not a lord, not a priest-king wrapped in divine language, the way some of the other names on the list are. A shepherd, someone who tends animals for a living, who sleeps outside, who smells like the flock he keeps day after day, season after season. The kind of title a scribe would use for a man near the bottom of a social order, not the top of one. Then comes the number. Dumuzid the shepherd is recorded as ruling for 36,000 years. Sit with that arithmetic because the tablet will not slow down to let you, and no footnote arrives to help. 36,000 years is longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. Longer than every dynasty, every empire, every written language combined, and then doubled. Not a long life, not even a long dynasty, a number with nothing meaningful to compare itself to, because nothing else in human experience is built to hold it, and the list records it exactly the way it recorded Alulim's 28,800 years back in Eridu, flatly, procedurally, without a flicker of the astonishment a modern reader supplies automatically, unasked every time. Whoever wrote this down either believed it completely or belonged to a system of belief where the truth of the number was never really the point. This is where the tablet stops being a curiosity and starts being a genuine problem. A problem that will not resolve itself just because a modern reader wants it to. Because there are only a handful of ways to make sense of what is sitting on the surface of that clay. The first, the number means exactly what it says, nothing less. Somewhere in the deep memory of Mesopotamian tradition, there was a belief, or a memory, that certain early rulers lived and reigned across a span of time no human body should survive. Taken at face value, this is not a metaphor. It is a claim about the physical duration of a life, the second, symbolic time. Mesopotamian scribes worked in a base 60 system, sexagesimal, the same system that gave the modern world 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Numbers like 36,000 break down cleanly inside that system, as ritual units, as sacred figures wearing the costume of a lifespan, carrying meaning that has nothing to do with elapsed years, the way a modern calendar might use 1,000 years to mean simply an unimaginable stretch of time, rather than a literal count. The third, divine kingship. In much of the ancient Near East, kings were not merely appointed by gods, they were extensions of them. Vessels through which divine authority moved from one generation to the next. If Dumuzid's reign measures not a human life but the duration of an office, a role renewed under the same name generation after generation, then 36,000 years might describe not one man, but a title, the way the crown outlasts any single person who wears it. The fourth is the strangest, that the number is memory, not myth, not metaphor. A garbled but sincere attempt to record something that belonged to an entirely different category of history than the one that came after it. Not longer human lives necessarily, not sacred numerology exactly. Something else, something the scribes themselves may not have fully understood, inherited from a period they could describe in outline but never fully explain. None of these four readings cancels out the others cleanly. Each solves part of the problem, each leaves another part standing. Assyriologists who spend entire careers on this document tend to hold more than one of these positions at once, shifting weight between them depending on which king, which city, which copy of the list they happen to be looking at that week. The Weld-Blundell Prism itself was compiled centuries after Dumuzid supposedly ruled, assembled from older lists that no longer survive independently. Which means even the scribes writing it down were working from tradition, not eyewitness memory, copying a copy of a copy, the way a historian today might reconstruct a lost era from second-hand references buried in later texts. Whatever the original source believed, it had already passed through unknown hands before it ever reached the clay we can hold now. There is a complication that makes Dumuzid harder to file away than the two kings of Eridu were. Outside the king list, in an entirely separate strand of Mesopotamian religion, there is a Dumuzid who is not a historical king at all, a shepherd god, consort of the goddess Inanna, a figure whose death and descent into the underworld became one of the most repeated myths in the ancient Near East, mourned in seasonal rituals for centuries across multiple cities, multiple generations of worshippers who had never seen a king named Dumuzid and never expected to. Two figures, same name, same profession, one filed under history, one filed under religion, both converging on a shepherd who does not behave like an ordinary man in either version. Is the king a faded memory of the god? Is the god a mythologized memory of the king? Or were they never separate to begin with? One figure remembered along two different tracks, until scribes eventually treated them as though they belonged to different categories entirely. A historical register on one side, a devotional cycle on the other, each preserving a different half of the same original memory. The list does not address this. It does not pause to explain why a shepherd would rule for 36,000 years. It does not acknowledge that the same name appears, wearing different clothes, in a completely different kind of text, written by different hands for entirely different purposes. It simply states the number, the way it stated every number before it, flat, procedural, and moves forward toward the moment when Bad-tibira, like Eridu before it, stops holding what it was given. The list does not linger on the fall, and it never has, not once, across the record so far. Bad-tibira held kingship, then it did not. The tablet spends no more ink on the collapse of a city that had just held a shepherd's 36,000-year reign than it spent on anything else. The same 4 words return, worn smooth from repetition. Its kingship to another city was carried. This time the destination is Larak. Larak is harder to picture than Eridu or Bad-tibira. Far less of it survives in the archaeological record. Its exact location is still debated, resting on later references in other texts, rather than an excavated site with its name still attached. Unlike Eridu, which archaeologists can walk across, Larak survives almost entirely as a name on a list, a place the tablet insists existed, holding real kingship, that the ground itself has not yet confirmed the way it confirmed Eridu's age. What survives clearly is not the city's ruins, but its entry on the tablet, a single king, a single number, sitting in the same unbroken sequence as everything before it. The king's name is Ensipadzianna. According to the tablet, he ruled Larak for 28,800 years. Notice what just happened. That number is not new. It is the exact figure the list already assigned to Alulim, the very first king of Eridu, back at the beginning of the record. 2 different kings, 2 different cities, separated by an entire fallen capital and an unknown span of history between them. And the scribes wrote down the identical span of time for both. This is the moment the pattern stops looking like a list of names and dates, and starts looking like a code. A single impossible number could be an error, a scribal exaggeration, a copying mistake, magnified across centuries of transmission, a number that repeats exactly, attached to 2 different men in 2 different cities separated by a fallen capital, is something else. It suggests the number carried meaning independent of whichever king happened to be wearing it, a fixed unit, deployed more than once. Consider what this repetition rules out. It rules out careless invention. Careless invention scatters numbers. It does not recycle them with this kind of precision. It also complicates the theory that each figure was chosen purely to flatter a dynasty, since flattery rarely requires reusing someone else's exact number instead of inventing a fresh one. Whatever produced these numbers, it followed rules consistent enough to land on the same figure twice, either by pure coincidence or because the repeat was never a coincidence at all. And yet the list does not flag the repetition, does not comment on it, does not explain it, does not even seem to notice it. The number simply appears again, filed under a different name, in a different place, with the same procedural flatness as everything else on the tablet. Larak falls in its turn. The formula executes exactly as it always does: hold, fall, carry, and kingship moves again. This time to Sippar. At Sippar, the list names a single king, Enmenduranna, a reign of 21,000 years. The number has shrunk from the previous entries, but only the way a landslide shrinks partway down a mountain. It is still nothing a human body could survive, still an order of magnitude beyond anything the post-flood section of this same document will ever record again. Smaller, not modest. Later tradition, outside the king list itself, remembers Sippar as a city bound to the sun god, to omens read from the sky, a detail the list does not mention, but when later scribes clearly felt belonged beside this king's memory. Sippar's fall follows the same formula, the same 4 words, the same absence of explanation. Kingship moves once more, to Shuruppak, where a king named Ubara-Tutu is recorded with a reign of 18,600 years. Smaller again, still impossible, still following the descending pattern that has now held across 5 cities, 5 kings, in a row. 5 cities, 5 kings, 5 falls, none of them narrated, none of them explained, all of them compressed into the same brief transfer formula that has carried kingship since the very first line of the record. Eridu to Bad-tibira, Bad-tibira to Larak, Larak to Sippar, Sippar to Shuruppak. Each transition identical in structure, wildly different in the specific number attached to it, every single number too large to fit inside an ordinary human life. By now, the shape of the thing is impossible to miss, even for a reader determined to explain away any one entry individually. This is not 5 unrelated legends bundled onto the same tablet. This is a single continuous register built on a repeating formula, applied without exception to every city that has held kingship since it first descended from heaven, and every single one of those cities without exception has fallen. Why does the formula never break, city after city, king after king? Why does the tablet never once pause to explain what is happening? What is being counted here, if not simply years? The list is, in effect, counting down, not toward a number, toward an event. Something is coming that will end this pattern entirely, something large enough that the scribes felt the need to mark, city by city, exactly how the world behaved in the stretch of time before it arrived. A world where kingship survived by moving, where reigns were measured in tens of thousands of years, where no capital, however long its king ruled, was ever allowed to stand for good, where every fall fed directly into the next rise, and the next rise into the next fall, in a chain that had run 5 links deep before anything finally broke it. Shuruppak is the 5th city. It will not be the last entry before the pattern breaks entirely. But what breaks it is not another fall to another city, not another transfer carried down the same worn formula. It is something larger than any single collapse the list has recorded so far, something the tablet has not yet named, waiting in the very next line for anyone still reading closely enough to notice the pattern was always building toward it. Shuruppak falls, and the tablet writes down a sentence unlike anything that came before it, anywhere in the record. Then the flood swept over. 4 words, the same clipped economy the list has used for every transfer so far, city after city, fall after fall, but this time there is no next city named, no new capital receiving what the old one lost. The formula that has repeated itself, unbroken, across 5 cities and 5 kings, simply stops. Whatever happened at Shuruppak did not carry kingship onward. It carried it away, out of the world the list has been describing since its very first line. After the flood, the list continues. It has to. Kingship descends again, and a new sequence begins at Kish, with new kings, new cities, a new register starting from scratch. But something fundamental changes. Permanently, without exception, for every entry that follows. The reigns shrink, not gradually, not the way Larak's number was smaller than Eridu's, or Sippar's smaller than Larak's. Each one still impossibly large in its own right, still nothing a real king could have lived through in one body. After the flood, the numbers fall out of the tens of thousands entirely, and land somewhere a human mind can actually hold. Kings reign for decades, occasionally a century, sometimes a little more, but nothing that requires an explanation beyond ordinary long life or ordinary scribal exaggeration. The post-flood section of the King List reads like a normal ancient document. The pre-flood section does not. Here is the detail worth carrying out of this entire record. The flood is not simply an event the list describes. It is the line the list itself draws between 2 different kinds of time. Everything before it behaves by one set of rules. Kingship measured in tens of thousands of years, cities that hold it briefly and then vanish, a shepherd who reigns longer than all of recorded civilization combined. Everything after it behaves by rules a modern reader recognizes instantly, because they are the same rules history has run on ever since. One line of clay, 2 entirely different worlds sitting on either side of it. It is worth noting who the tablet says was ruling Shuruppak when the water arrived. Ubara-Tutu is, in later Mesopotamian tradition outside the King List, remembered as the father of a figure named Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood survivor who appears again, under different names, in the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh as Utnapishtim, and later still in a text far more familiar to most modern readers, carrying a boat, a family, and a pair of every living creature through the same catastrophe. 3 cultures, 3 names. The same man apparently surviving the same water, remembered by 3 different traditions that had no obvious reason to agree with each other. The King List does not tell that part of the story. It simply hands off at the exact right moment, from a king with an impossible reign to a lineage remembered elsewhere, as the one that made it through. Lay the whole sequence out in order, the way the scribes laid it out on the clay, and the shape of it is impossible to unsee. Kingship descends from heaven. It settles first in Eridu, where 2 kings, Alulim and Alalngar, rule for a combined 64,800 years before the city falls. It moves to Bad-tibira, where Dumuzid the Shepherd, a humble title wrapped around an impossible number, reigns for 36,000 years before that city falls too. It moves to Larak, where Ensipadzianna rules for 28,800 years, the exact figure the list already used once before, as though the number itself outlasted the men who carried it. It moves to Sippar, to Enmenduranna, 21,000 years. It moves to Shuruppak, to Ubara-Tutu, 18,600 years. City after city, number after number, never explained. 5 cities, 5 kings. One relentless formula: hold, fall, carry. Repeated without variation, without explanation, without a single scribal aside acknowledging that any of it should raise a question in anyone reading it, then or now. And then, at Shuruppak, the formula breaks. Not because a 6th city received what a 5th one lost, but because there was no receiving city left standing to name. The flood did not continue the pattern. It ended it, completely, in a way none of the 5 falls before it ever did. What kind of record keeps this careful an account of something it apparently does not even understand itself? Because that is what the King List reads like, from the very first sentence to the last line before the flood. Not a myth enjoying its own exaggerations, reaching for bigger numbers the way storytellers often do when a tale gets retold one generation too many. Not a folktale reaching for drama either. Folktales vary in the retelling, and this list, copy after copy, keeps landing on the same figures with a consistency drama alone rarely produces. A register. A bureaucratic account kept the way a government keeps records, applied with total consistency to reigns no bureaucracy should ever have needed to measure. As though whoever first set this down was recording something they had actually witnessed, or had been told about by someone close enough to the source to get the details right, even as the meaning behind those details had already started to slip away. Literal time, symbolic numerology, an inherited divine office, or a memory belonging to a category of history modern minds no longer have a name for. It is possible more than one of these is partly true at once. That a real memory of something extraordinary was preserved by people who no longer had the original context to interpret it, and who wrapped it in whatever framework was available to them at the time. Sacred numbers, divine kingship, ritual duration. A distorted signal is still a signal. It is not the same as silence, and perhaps that is the most honest place to leave it. 4,000 years of copying, recopying, and reinterpreting stand between whoever first spoke these numbers aloud and the clay a modern reader can still hold today. Somewhere in that long chain of hands, meaning almost certainly shifted, a literal record becoming a symbolic one, or a symbolic one being mistaken, generations later, for a literal one, or some combination the surviving evidence simply cannot untangle. What survived is not the original meaning. What survived is the shape the meaning left behind, pressed into clay, still legible, still asking the same unanswered question it has been asking since the first scribe copied it down from a source even he could no longer fully explain. 36,000 years. That is where this began, a number attached to a shepherd, sitting in a list that treats it with the same flat administrative tone it uses for everything else, refusing the entire way through to explain itself. The tablet does not choose between these explanations for us. It simply keeps recording, city by city, king by king, fall by fall, until the flood arrives and the rules of time quietly, permanently change. The clay has already survived 4,000 years. It is not going anywhere. Museums keep it behind glass. Scholars keep translating it, copy by copy. The number is still there. Waiting the same way it has always waited, for whoever reads it next to decide what a shepherd ruling 36,000 years was actually trying to tell them